Now, there's a new report out in the Financial Times. Now, writer Frank Partnoff warned about the incoming financial crisis. Well, not that it's coming, actually, but that it's already here. Now, he explains that politicians have been essentially destroying any and all financial regulations that were made post-2008. Because of that, the conditions are ripe and set up for another massive financial meltdown. Now, let me get into the article and give you some quotes. Now, he writes that while the U.S. administration talks of repealing the Dodd-Frank bill, the reality is that regulators have been flouting the law for years, and now the shadow financial markets are frothing. Almost a decade after the global financial crisis, the sequel has arrived. Now, look, that is incredibly ominous. The writer's not pulling any punches here. He's saying, no, you understand, it's already here. We've already set the stage. And look, 2008 was a complete disaster. Now, interestingly enough, in 2008, we had Barack Obama come in to try to do something to end the recession. Now, he did some very unpopular things. I criticized him for example, bailing out the banks. And there seemed to be this little thing called Occupy that also felt the same way. They were also angry at the banks for and President Obama for bailing out those banks and not bailing out the taxpayer. However, got to give him credit for at least doing some stimulus that actually tried to help. Now, do you think we're going to get any of that with Donald Trump? I don't know, man. But my point is, okay, so the incoming meltdown of the economy, that is kind of a bold claim. The fact that we're heading into the next global financial crisis, again, extraordinary. So why does he think that is? Well, he explains. The central culprit this time is the collateralized loan obligation, or CLO. Like its earlier esoteric cousins, the CDO, a CLO bundles risky low-grade loans into attractive packages and high credit ratings. Now, wait a minute here. So these are risky low-grade loans, and yet they are being packaged in a so-called attractive package with very high credit ratings. Well, that's weird, right? If they're risky and low grade, why have such a high credit rating? I don't quite understand. Like the fact that these loans are low grade, that's risk, right? So anybody who looks at that should look at that risk and be like, well, let's make a risk assessment. If we want to invest in this package, we should know that there's some sort of risk involved. Instead, credit rating agencies are going, no, these are great. These are AAA rated packages. You should buy them immediately. Immediately. But wait, these loan packages have a higher, likelihood of exploding. Why would you have a good credit rating? Well, it's to make people want to buy it, as I said. Investors buy these packages, and the sellers are essentially making money off what they consider to be junk. And a lot of these, instead of, like, we already did something like this when it came to home loans, now we're doing it with business loans. Now, you get some examples here. In May, there were 2 deals of more than $1 billion each, and experts estimate that $75 billion worth are coming this year alone. Now, Antares Capital recently closed a $2.1 billion CLO, the largest in the U.S. since 2006, and the third largest in history. Although most of the loans underlying these deals are of junk status, more than half of the new debt is rated AAA. Sound familiar? He asks. Yes, it actually sounds very familiar. In fact, I believe Senator Carl Levin of Michigan had a word for these kind of loans. Shitty. Now, he continues by offering some context. He said during the early 2000s, similarly high-rated deals called collateralized debt obligations, those CDOs, were very popular. At first, he said, they seemed harmless, or at least not so big that their collapse would cause financial contagion. But when regulators ignored their growth, they became more opaque and more profitable, with credit ratings disconnected from reality. So wait a minute. Back then they had the CDO that packaged up these low risk or these low grade, very risky loans, and they gave them great credit ratings, and so they sold. And on Wall Street, when you sell, you keep doing the things that are going to make you the most money. Now, he said, like cracks in a building's foundation, The risks seemed minor at first, but high ratings hid the instability of the entire structure until it was too late. And again, we know what happened. We lived through it. First the financial crisis, and then the recession, which was disastrous for so many people, so many families. A lot of people lost their 401ks or retirements. A lot of people lost their jobs. But you know who it wasn't bad for? Some of those executives of the failed banks who ended up having giant golden parachutes, getting paid millions, sometimes billions of dollars for crashing their company into the ground. So that's why they're doing this. Now, before you ask, hey, wait a minute. Okay, so that happened. Didn't we pass a law to prevent that from happening again? Well, yes, that would be Dodd-Frank. Now, unfortunately, Dodd-Frank is very weak. You had Republicans and corporate Democrats going in and saying, okay, we got this Dodd-Frank law. Let's water it down. It seems like it's too hard on the bank. It's too harsh. They'd learn their lesson. They're not going to do this again, right? So we're just going to let them flout some of these rules. Now, they did that, of course, not because they believed the banks actually learned their lesson. It's because they had millions of dollars in campaign contributions by the finance industry. And because of that, the politicians, they decided they were going to chip away at it. And look, I've been critical of Dodd-Frank because it actually, I don't think it went far enough. But then it started out weak. And then it eventually got watered down to the point of where it was completely, or most completely ineffectual. Okay. Now, the author writes, in the time since it was implemented, the SEC has permitted the agencies to dodge the law. While Dodd-Frank imposed liability on the agencies for false ratings, the SEC exempted them. Likewise, Congress barred the agencies from getting inside information about issuers they rate, but the SEC permitted that too. And last Christmas Eve, the so-called risk retention rule of Dodd-Frank took effect, requiring the arrangers of these complex deals keep a slice of the downside. However, clever financiers arranged for third parties to take on this risk. So, okay, so what he's saying is that these companies will get other companies to take on their risk for them to negate this rule. Okay, well, if it's not their risk, but all the reward for doing things that might endanger the entire financial system and destabilize it, well, they're still going to go and actually do that because, again, it's all reward, no risk. Oh, boy. And, of course, if you're a financier, what are you going to do? You're going to chase short-term profit every time. And, look, and if that means the riskier loans could sink those third parties, well, hey, man, it's their risk, not my risk. Okay, it's not my company. Now, again, he talked about the high credit ratings, right? There's some of these loans getting AAA. Now, it's rather odd that these junk loans would get such a high credit rating, isn't it? I mean, why would they give them? Because, of course, they're in on it, and they explain that they have outdated software. Interesting. The credit rating agencies, particularly Moody's Investors and S&P, are the central actors in the story, just as in the original. The computer programs they use to assign AAA ratings remain flawed. Because loan defaults can come in waves, mathematical models should account for correlation risk, which is the chance that defaults might occur simultaneously, which is what happened in 2008. But the models for CLOs assume correlations are low. When defaults occur at the same time, the supposed AAA investments would be wiped out. He ends up saying CLOs are just CDOs in a new wrap. Now look, I think a lot of you probably know I'm not an expert in financial matters, but I do see some red flags here, and I'm sure you do as well. The first one is, of course, the gutting of regulations like Dodd-Frank. You've got the exemptions. Basically, it means that the financial environment has essentially changed very little since 2008. And if the regulatory environment is the same, and there's no disincentives, there's only incentives to continue doing what they did before, Well, why would we expect the banks to act any differently and not do these risky investments and not wrap these up into bad securities? Okay. Especially when there's billions and billions of dollars at stake. I mean, look, going back to one of those recent deals, right? Half of those, half of those deals, right, were made up of junk loans. Junk loans. So, man, that is a red flag. Okay. Now, there's another red flag here. Partnov recently sent a Freedom of Information Act request seeking to identify which credit rating agencies have been found to violate SEC rules. The regulators refuse to divulge names. Violators remain anonymous. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but again, violators don't have the incentive to not violate if they remain anonymous. I mean, imagine the PR if you're a bank and you're like, hey, by the way, you're violating SEC rules. You're violating the rules. You're screwing over the people that you're supposed to work for, which is the consumer, the investor. That's going to make people not want to invest in your company and not want to buy your products, right? Your financial products. Instead, the SEC is now letting them be anonymous. So business as usual. So that's not really a risk. I don't really have to worry about any kind of fallout from buying, from when these bad investments explode. Now, there's more, of course. Now, here's an example of some of the hubris on Wall Street. Earlier this month, Ashish Shah, a managing director of Madison Capital Funding, a subsidiary of New York Life, told a roundtable of CLO experts that, hey man, don't worry about defaults. Okay, defaults not going to happen, so keep investing. He said the appetite for assets is ferocious. This does not bode well, man. It's the same kind of stuff that they were saying back before the crash in 2008. Now, again, another red flag. According to the article, many of the least creditworthy businesses are finding it very easy to borrow because their loans, these non-creditworthy agencies are getting these loans very, very easily so they could package them up and sell them again with AAA credit ratings. Now, he also warns that while some might claim CLOs are different or smaller, or that regulators are better prepared today, which I laugh, or that business loans could not possibly default all at once, as home mortgages did. But similar arguments were made about the risks in the early 2000s before they spread to the major banks in AIG, and the markets spiraled out of control. He cautions that during the debates about repealing Dodd-Frank, which is what they were talking about, legislators should keep their eyes on these complex investments and the agencies that facilitate them. And says that if you want to avoid an even bigger crisis, regulators should heed warnings about financial dysfunction and hidden risks now before the cracks spread. So again, that is a pretty dire warning, and this isn't the first time I've heard that warning. And I believe it. I don't think that we fixed the inherent problems that led to the first financial crisis. And in fact, all of the incentives are the same. Banks are still too big to fail. In fact, they're actually even bigger than they were before. Most of the new rules are not in effect. They're actually being sidestepped daily. And now they're treating business loans the same way that they treated home loans. This is not good. Now, look, there's no way that this cannot go bad. Now, look, I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that maybe there's something that I'm missing. Again, I'm not an expert in finance, but I can see the warning signs for what they are, and all those signs are there. And this time, if this happens, we're going to have Trump in charge to deal with it. God help us all. If the economy goes with Trump, I don't know how we're going to get out of it. But, and the Republicans, man, full speed ahead on deregulating even more and more of our financial industry because the banks, man, they got to get paid. And they don't care who they hurt in order to do so. So, Donald Trump was the first iceberg. Here's the second one. Again, we can see it coming. And Republicans are like, full speed ahead. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.